Hi, I'm Gregory Hodgson, and we're here at the 2018 Canadian Science Policy Conference, and I'm joined by Dr. Gail Krantzberg, who's a professor of engineering and public policy at McMaster University. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
So I wanted to start by asking you, in 2005, your department started offering the first Masters of Engineering and Public Policy program, which I think is very important to teaching young scientists and engineers about public policy to facilitate greater communication down the line. So I wondered if you could just start by telling us a bit about your role with the program and about your work at McMaster.
Well, it was a really fascinating move on behalf of McMaster to even think about engineers needing to be prolific, needing to have the experience about talking to policymakers or being involved in the policy process. I'm amazed at the innovation that McMaster showed there. My inclination to join the program was because I was a scientist working for the province and then got thrust into the policy making field with no skill set whatsoever. I had no idea how public policy worked. And after fumbling through that for many years, and after a few career changes, I had the opportunity to lead this new program, training engineers and scientists on how the public policy process works. This soft science. Our engineers like formulas, our scientists like methods, and they'll come to me at the end of the day for their final thesis and say, what's the formula, like, what's the format? And it's up to you. It's what you've discovered. It's what you've invented. It's what you've learned through your exploration of what others have been doing, and it's all the soft skills and it's really fascinating. It's wonderful to see the engineers who come to the program really wanting to contribute to policy making and understanding they don't have the skills.
So that's something that you touched on about starting your career without having really any idea about the policy side of it. What do you think currently is the greatest challenge to facilitating greater communication between scientists or engineers and policymakers based on their results?
Good question, Greg. It goes both ways. On the one hand, there are policymakers who don't believe engineering or science is particularly important. It's all economics, public demand, public perception, and that moves things forward, and we'll bring in some engineering and science along the way if we need to. So there's this, not all policymakers, of course, but some policymakers don't really believe that the science is that fundamental to good policy, which is flawed. And you'll see it when you see flawed policy because it's not scientifically grounded, not engineeringly sound, and so the policy doesn't really make sense, it doesn't work. On the other side, you have scientists who like their science. And there are some scientists who, when you ask them, well, how is your science relevant to policymakers, they will say, I don't care. It's my science. So for those scientists, I say, it's not for you. But if you're a scientist who is frustrated that your science, what you're learning, what you're discovering, is not influencing change in society, then you need to talk a different language. You need to explain your science in English in ways that are relevant to what a policymaker is thinking, which is, why should I take action at this time? I have competing priorities. Who is this going to affect? How is this going to be equitable? How am I going to afford this? Those are not science questions, but as a scientist, you have to go understanding the policymaker is going to be putting your science into the context of those kinds of questions. And you need to be ready for that.
So you're saying that it's really a matter of both parties having their own point of view and needing to better understand the point of view of the opposite party, but perhaps the onus is really on the scientists if they want to see an impact of their work to take it upon themselves to understand their work in the context of policy and frame it and communicate it effectively in that way.
Yes, absolutely. Scientists tend, and I'm a scientist so I can say this, scientists tend to use a language that they're so used to, they don't realize it has become their jargon. So I was at a meeting many years ago, very proud of myself being able to talk about what's going on, and so it was about contaminants and sediment, which is very complicated, and I was able to talk about the little life forms that eat the particles in the mud and accumulate poisons in them. That's very different than saying benthic macroinvertebrates bioaccumulate metals. But somebody who's so used to their science will go to a policymaker and say, we've got to stop those bentho-macroinvertebrates from bioaccumulating. And you know, what are you talking about? Well, so you need to realize that you're so embedded in that language that you need to speak it to your neighbor. How would you talk about your science to your neighbor who has absolutely no training in your field? How would you say it to your sister or your brother or your kid? And those are the tools that scientists really need. But it's also true that policymakers will look for a simple solution. Give me the number. How good is the water? Is it on a scale from 1 to 50? How good is it? And it seems to a scientist that's so simplistic. There's so much uncertainty, I can't answer that question. So the policymakers seems to want a very simple, straightforward answer when sometimes it's very complicated science. And I think they need to understand and be a bit more flexible that the science will come with uncertainty, and the policy needs to reflect that and say the science is uncertain, and so we'll put in place a policy which we will revisit in 3 to 5 years as the science improves and change our policy if it need be. Because one of the hardest things for a policymaker is to change policy. Because politically, if you do that, your opposition may say, well, you put the wrong policy in place, what were you doing? And you say, no, we put a policy in place based on incomplete science, and now we're constantly adapting and making our policies nimble and responsive to the newest science possible. And I think that would be really strong for a policymaker to be able to say.
Mm-hmm. So I understand that you're participating in a panel session here at the CSPC later this morning that's entitled Water at the Science Policy Interface, talking about opportunities and challenges for Canada. And I'm sure that a lot of the things that you've just been discussing are going to come up in that discussion. And I was just wondering, what do you think would be some concrete measures or strategies that we could put in place, just as you say, to make sure that there's policy that's able to adapt to uncertainties in science and changes in science and changes in government? Can you elaborate on that at all?
So there's a few things. One thing that I think would be very helpful would be for government organizations, because government does public policy. So for government organizations who have their policy people and then they have their scientists, to have a very structured, mandatory gathering of the science and the policy people together, maybe quarterly. Start talking to each other about what you're doing. What is your science saying? And the policy people could say, I don't understand, what's the point of that science? And the policymaker could say, I need a solution to X. Are any of my scientists doing any work on that? And lo and behold, nobody is. So having that conversation, breaking down that barrier, just having the 2 directors or 2 ADMs or whatever they are, assistant deputy ministers, whatever they are, making it mandatory that the science branch and the policy branch that would be working together have a lunch, I don't care what it is, start the conversation. That's really important. Another thing would be training. I would suggest to you that if you have in your organization scientists and engineers who really do want to influence public policy and they're grappling with how it works, train them. And this is not an infomercial for McMaster University. There's lots of programs on how public policy process works. They may not be designed for engineers and scientists, but there's lots of training on how public policy works. So send your scientists and send your engineers off to some courses. Train them on that. Don't expect them to learn it on their own. And then they become more eloquent in terms of how they can communicate with the policymaker. And finally, on the final point, to your actually first point of your question, I think it's about a culture of change. And I don't really know how this comes about, except with the leadership of the politician, to be able to say that our policies are science-based, they're fact-based, and as long as the science and the facts are subject to question, our policies will be subject to revision. And that is legitimate, and that is sound, and that is using the taxpayer's dollar wisely, because we're not sticking to our guns just because we said it, we do it one way, when the evidence tells us we need to do it a different way. And I think politicians need to be able to speak that truth and make it very clear that that's a responsible way to behave.
That's a really good point. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you one final question, and that is, what do you see as the greatest value of the Canadian Science Policy Conference?
Oh goodness, this very conversation we're having, it's happening in all the hallways. We have scientists and we have policymakers in rooms talking about grants, talking about collaboration. We have panelists which have just the scientists and just the policymakers in the same room together when they never have been in the same room before, listening to each other. So I think it's the gathering of just the two disciplines together, talking about very challenging societal issues with a science lens and with a policy lens. I think that melding of those two communities together is the strongest thing that this conference does, this organization does.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much.